If you're an avid gamer, you've probably played at least one indie game. At this point, they're unavoidable. You got your Hollow Knight, Disco Elysium, Stardew Valley, Dead Cells, Cuphead, Celeste, Hades, Limbo. There's so much out there that's categorized as an indie game that it almost loses its meaning when you try to define it. The term independent is usually tacked on to some form of media type like movies or music, and typically it refers to a single person or small group of people that work on a project independent from some sort of publishing company. This means that the project was financially independent or independent from influence outside of the control of the artist or developer. Nowadays, AAA game studios spend millions of dollars churning out essentially blockbuster games that are designed to suck you in for hundreds of hours so you could come out the other side and say,
"By the gods, what have I become?"
Now, this isn't to say that some indie games aren't also designed to suck you in for a long time, but this still raises the question, why do indie games matter? To help answer this question, I think it'd be interesting to take a look at a brief history of the genre. When computers were made more commercially accessible in the late 70s and early 80s, there were bedroom coders. They would work on small projects using the program BASIC, which was a pre-installed computer language. I like to think of it as the earliest version of Super Mario Maker, since the software helped provide a common framework to create games through. These early developers would buy out advertisements in newspapers to sell their game, or would freelance and sell their games to a software house. A software house was a publisher that would then distribute the game to a wider audience. As console gaming rose in the 90s and dominated the industry, creating games independently became a more daunting task, especially if you wanted to profit from it. In the 90s, shareware helped circumvent these costs for indie game developers and gave consumers an opportunity to play a demo of the game before it was fully released. But again, this wasn't exactly the most financially viable option. Early game developer Chris Crawford noted, "We've pretty much passed the period where hobbyists could put together a game that would have commercial prospect. If you want to do a game, do it for fun, but don't try to do game designs to make any money. The odds are so much against the individual that I would hate to wish that heartbreak on anyone." Well, unfortunately, he had a point. At that time, the amount of capital and resources to develop games and to be able to spread it to as many people as possible was astronomical, and games that were made by these bedroom coders were seen more as avant-garde pieces of art rather than something to really sink your teeth into. Though, when the internet came along, it changed the game. Literally. The digitization of the gaming industry allowed for small-time creators to finally be able to reach millions of people at a much lower cost. Online distributors like Steam, Xbox Game Pass, and eventually the Epic Games Store gave indie game developers a chance to worry about designing the game rather than distributing the product. The evolution to digital gaming allowed for a more efficient process in game development and gave creators more room to innovate and experiment with different types of games, which is what independent developers are historically known for. The ease of access also generated a boom in popularity and quantity of indie games. Since Steam's initial release in 2003, the amount of indie games that were published by the platform stayed relatively small until about 2014, where the number of games added to Steam more than doubled. And then from 2014 to 2016, it almost tripled in growth to about 5,500 games. Then, 2020 saw a boost to 10,000 games on the platform. Compared to 2004, where there were 7 independently developed games added, the growth of the medium was exponential. This rise of indie games also helped foster communities of gamers that were able to more easily communicate with developers and were able to establish a relationship that wasn't necessarily seen before in the industry. I should also note that indie games provide more frugal options for consumers. The ability to pick up hundreds of hours worth of content for under $30 is a feat in and of itself, especially when the average price of games are approaching $65 to $70. Now, it's important to understand that the history and evidence of indie games' growing popularity don't tell us the whole picture of why they matter. It really just sets the foundation for how the genre has carved its role in the gaming industry. Allowing more room for developers to take risks and experiment without fear of upsetting shareholders' interest is what allows indie games to shine. That isn't to say indie developers don't have much to lose, because in many cases they have everything to lose if the project they've been working on for years just flops. But the difference in these risk factors is the ability to have creative freedom without fear of your funding being taken away. By definition, these developers are not beholden to corporate interests that are looking for the next yearly franchise. So, innovation and experimentation are incentivized at a fundamental level. You might also be wondering why I use quotation marks when I say the word genre. That's because while I was making this video, I was having a hard time finding a consistent way to define indie games. Genre is a term used to classify media into different categories based on similar characteristics. In gaming, you have first-person shooters, role-playing games, fighting games, platforms, roguelikes, so many different genres to choose from. However, when it comes to indie games, you could still have indie platformers like Hollow Knight, or indie fighting games like Brawlhalla. Yet, indie games are found in genre lists on Steam and Xbox Game Pass. If you want to get even more pedantic, should we consider some games to be more indie than others? If indie games are defined as games made independent of publisher funding and influence, then are the games that are made by fewer people considered more indie? Like, is Stardew Valley, made by the one developer Concerned Ape, more of an indie game than, say, Fall Guys or Hades, since those games were made by larger development teams? If we're going strictly by the definition, then yes. And that doesn't really make sense because genres, like I said, are all about defining characteristics within the gameplay. Even then, we have a name for games that are made by mid-sized development teams, and those are called AA games, which is intended to catch this weird middle ground. This is to catch games like Divinity Original Sin 2 that have the same breadth and scope of world building comparable to Skyrim, but are still made with a smaller budget and development team compared to AAA game studios like Bethesda. It would be unfair to compare a game like that to Celeste, where its clear direction was for the game to be a cute and challenging platformer, and not a 100+ hour RPG. So I think it's fair to say that the term indie game has been used as a catch-all umbrella phrase that refers to a wide category of games. But I digress. We still need to clearly define why indie games matter, and what better way than to talk about how the medium has been utilized as an art form. The video games as an art form controversy has been a widely debated topic that even renowned film critic Roger Ebert chimed in on. He said, "To my knowledge, no one in or out of the field has ever been able to cite a game worthy of comparison with the great dramatists, poets, filmmakers, novelists, and composers. That a game can aspire to artistic importance as a visual experience, I accept, but for most gamers, video games represent a loss of those precious hours we have available to make ourselves more cultured, civilized, and empathetic." He then goes on to clarify a couple years later, saying, "It has rules, points, objectives, and an outcome." Someone might cite an immersive game without points or rules, but I would say then it ceases to be a game and becomes a representation of a story, a novel, a play, dance, a film. Those are things you cannot win, you can only experience them.
What?
Okay, so the first quote is definitely more inflammatory than the second. You might as well chalk up every gamer to be like Cartman in the South Park episode about WoW.
Oh, that's a big boy, isn't he?
It's pretty ridiculous to say that games can only be qualified as an art form if there are games worthy of comparison to the works of Shakespeare or Beethoven. Is he saying that caveman paintings aren't considered art? Now, I might be stretching what he's saying, but in either case, that's still not a sufficient way to define art on a more broad scope. In regards to his second quote about games having rules and objectives and therefore not being art, then he's just adding more pieces to the puzzle of art. There are plenty of video games that can only be experienced as a video game, and also might not have clear objectives or rules. For instance, the game Flower is all about you roaming the landscape as a breeze of flower petals, and the purpose of the game is for you to explore and to quite literally go where the wind takes you. Other games like Outer Wilds is most definitely an experience that can only be told through the medium of video games, and this game has an objective, although it's not as clear as it could be, which is the point. You have to explore your nearby solar system to uncover the mysteries of an ancient alien race. It contains a story that is told through the vehicle of your own curiosity, and even though you may learn the story in a different timeline than other players, everyone still experiences the same feeling, just as if everyone was reading the same book or watch the same movie and notice details that another person may not have noticed. Now, to be fair, I can see how film critics might be skeptical of video games being an art form in 2005. But I'm sure 100 years ago, art critics were spouting the same arguments for filmmaking as an art form in the early days of cinema. Unfortunately, Ebert died in 2013, so he wasn't able to see the explosion in popularity of indie games that came the year after his death. He also wasn't able to see how some game developers have been able to take risks in their games, not just in game design, but in stylistic choices as well. The game Return of the Obra Dinn, while released in 2018, decided to use old Macintosh-era graphics to convey a certain tone of the story and establish a setting. Just like in any visual art form, the developers were able to consciously strive for an aesthetic using pre-established techniques in order to communicate a certain feeling the audience should experience. Similar to how artists use different techniques to evoke a feeling, like choosing a graphite pencil or colored pencils for their piece. This is all to say that fundamentally, indie games have been able to carve out a special place in the games industry. By nature, indie games are not held to account by corporate interests, which allow developers to work freely on games that they are interested in creating, and have the breathing room to explore different styles of art and game design. AAA games still find ways to innovate, but since their sole goal is motivated by profit, then they have to make sure that the game is accepted by a wider audience, which means artistic sacrifices have to be made in order for the game to reach commercial success. Even then, that doesn't necessarily mean that the game is guaranteed to be more successful. It's also important for the games industry to have some diversity in terms of what is accessible to everyone's interests. If it were all just blockbuster action games like Call of Duty or Assassin's Creed, then I wouldn't have a game like Stardew Valley to bug my fiancé to play with me all the time. That, to me, is why indie games matter.